Welcome back to Focus on Wales. My name's Kyle Bright and joining me today is Adam Griffiths. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Yeah, well, give us 30 or 40 minutes out of your day and we'll run through all you need to know in Welsh politics with only 38 days to go when this releases until the Senedd election. So the campaign is very much underway, isn't it?
It's getting close.
Yeah, as the Reform candidates have been revealed, Tory candidates have been revealed. In fact, as this goes out, it will be the deadline for the parties to announce their candidates. So best be hoping they've all got their candidates out, isn't
And today, I believe, as of recording, is the last day of Senedd business as well.
Yeah, no, that's right, isn't it? Yeah. So there has been certainly a rush through the week to get a lot done, which means there is a lot to talk about. So we're going to be setting the scene this week by looking into the polling, some of those candidates, whether they're up for the job. So let's start with those top headline figures with that polling. Right, so have you seen the latest polling that came out on Tuesday this week?
I have, yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, so it came out, of course, from YouGov and ITV, and they tend to have some of the more larger sample sizes in their polls. So this time it was, I think, over 2,000, which tends to mean that the poll is a bit more reliable. But these are the headline figures. So Plaid Cymru are on 33%, Reform are on 27%, Labour on 13%, the Greens on 12%, so very close. The Conservatives on 7%, the Lib Dems on 5%, and then all the others on 4%. So some minor shifts going on, but nothing major compared to the last YouGov ITV poll, because that's probably the most comparative poll to look at. If we look at the seats, though, which are sort of, I think, more important, isn't it? Plaid Cymru would be projected by YouGov to have 43 seats, Reform 30, Labour 12, the Greens on 10, the Conservatives on 1, and then, unfortunately, the Lib Dems on 0. So a lot to talk here, but I think it's probably best first to talk about the big players here. So, of course, Plaid Cymru and Reform. The magic number for a majority is 49 seats, isn't it? So what are the options for Plaid Cymru then?
Well, obviously, with this poll, there are kind of two options if Plaid want a majority government. So obviously they could go with the Greens or with Labour. I mean, I suppose in theory they could go with Reform as well, but I really don't think that's likely to happen.
Oh gosh, some cross-party collaboration.
Truly,
that would be
the rainbowest of coalitions there. But obviously the only two kind of realistic options are kind of Plaid and Labour or Plaid and the Greens. But obviously a completely feasible option here as well would be for Plaid to govern as a minority government, which is kind of their ideal situation. I think.
So if they were to govern as a minority, that would mean that they'd have to find support on a case-by-case basis, right? So if they had to pass a budget, they would have to go to the other parties and try and maybe do some concessions to get their support, which I think Plaid Cymru have put forward that is their preferred option. I can remember one of their representatives on ITV's Sharp End programme saying that that was the option that they will go for. That is, if they have the numbers to do it, because they will be having to get that support. Under this poll, they could turn to the Greens for that support, and then they don't even have to look at other parties like Labour. But not all the polls are saying that, so that is worth thinking about, isn't it? Reform's options, less positive, aren't they?
Yeah, much more slim. Because if Reform are on, I believe, 30 seats in this poll, right?
Yeah, 30 seats.
Yeah, and with the Conservatives on 1, that's 31 seats across the right-wing bloc, which is not enough to get anything even close to passed. And I think it's really difficult to see how any parties would work with Reform other than the Conservatives. I think, as with any time we're kind of discussing the polls in the Senedd election, there's really no situation that seems conceivable where even if Reform do quite well in this election, they're actually going to be anywhere near government or legislative power.
Yeah, well, that's the issue, isn't it? The other parties have come out and said that they don't really want to work with Reform, so I guess there was a time a while back where even the Lib Dems might be open to that, but I think nowadays they tend to slant more towards the left, don't they?
Yeah, definitely.
So they're not even willing to work with Reform, and then there aren't really any other smaller parties that will hold any ground in this case. And I think that is the issue. It's because the Reform vote is very much taking away from what the Conservative vote was. Yeah. So we're seeing like the Conservatives, as they decline, Reform are going up. And I think it's best to look at this as a sort of progressive block of voters, right, who are on the left, and then the conservative right-wing block of voters. And if you put those together, which I'm sure I'll put up in like a graphic or something, it's actually the case that 2/3 of Welsh voters in this poll would be on that progressive left bloc, which I think is the main thing to pay attention to, because that really leaves the conservative right wing with not really many routes to government, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think this is kind of the issue that the right always has had, and probably always will for at least the foreseeable future have in Wales, which is that there really just isn't, there just is not the amount of support on the right that they need to have a reasonable chance at governing. And this is why Wales always has been, for basically its entire electoral history, a place where parties of the left always dominate.
Yeah, exactly. Well, one other angle to look at this from, of course, is Labour. So through the history of devolution, Labour have always been, well, South Wales and the whole of Wales has always been called sort of a Labour stronghold, sort of in the Senedd and so on. So this is really unique and interesting in the sense that Labour not only will be out of government as the main party in control, but if Plaid do look to the Greens for support, whether it's through a coalition, so teaming up with them, or through a minority government and finding Green support on a case-by-case basis, it means that Labour won't have any amount of control at all with it, which is quite interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, what's entirely plausible with a kind of scenario like this is that Plaid decide to kind of go, like we said, on a case-by-case basis. So I think that would probably involve, you know, with some pieces of legislation or some bills and things like this, Plaid seeking support from the Greens, and then on others seeking support from Labour, and possibly even kind of mixing and matching. But I think that would be very difficult with kind of party lines and things like this. So yeah, but either way, there's no space for any sort of coalition or ministerial positions for Labour or the Greens.
Well, it's worth mentioning that Labour in past, actually, with, I think it was the last budget, wasn't it? They passed that through finding the support of Jane Dodds. Who was now, isn't it? Was the sole Lib Dem, but of course the Senedd is now sort of out of business and will be dissolved soon. So it's in the past now. That's how close we are to the next Senedd. But yeah, it is really interesting to us, probably less interesting to Labour, who probably won't be very happy about that news. Another interesting thing that's been mentioned in this polling is how YouGov have broken down what they think each of the seats will look like. So each of those 16 mega constituencies, how the 6 seats in each one will be broken down by party. And if we look at the First Minister's seat, it's looking like she's going to lose it, and Labour, in fact, aren't going to get any seats in that constituency. So it's a pretty significant moment for the history of devolution. I think it's the first time that a First Minister is going to lose her seat in that sort of way, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it would act as a really symbolic kind of...
Very symbolic.
...representation of the decline of Labour in this election. You know, about when we had the general election in 2024, there was a lot of talk about whether or not Rishi Sunak would lose his seat, and kind of acting as a kind of symbol of the death of the Conservatives. I don't think that this would necessarily signal the death of Labour or anything like that, but I think that it would be seen as like an extremely, you know, massive kind of turning point in the history of the Senedd to see this happen. Yeah,
and then conversely, on the Conservative side, we're seeing that the one seat which will be remaining is poor Welsh Conservative leader Darren Millar, who's going to be in a sort of situation similar to the Liberal Democrats, how they've been for the last few years, isn't it? Where Jane Dodds has been alone in the Senedd, so that will be interesting as well, isn't it?
Yeah, he'll have nobody to lead but himself.
Yeah. So that is an interesting dynamic, isn't it, from those seat breakdowns, and I'll put up a map of all the seats so you can sort of see what's going on. Another interesting thing from that projection was that I think Plaid were getting at least 3 seats in most of those constituencies. So a lot of dominance there, because usually it's said that their heartland is like West Wales, North Wales.
Yeah, North and West.
Yeah,
Wales,
so seeing them bridging the gap into South and Mid Wales is progress on their part, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's very kind of demonstrative of the fact that Plaid for quite a while have been kind of trying to cultivate this kind of coalition of your kind of northwest, kind of rural Welsh language speaking, and a combination of that and your kind of left-wing progressives who are a bit too left-wing for Labour. And I think there's always perhaps been a bit of an uneasy alliance there, but obviously in this election it seems that that's going to kind of really turn out for Plaid.
Yeah, and then another thing which could be interesting for Plaid is that in the more urban seats, so if we look at the 2 seats around Cardiff, it's looking like the Greens are actually going to have a little bit more of a fight with Plaid there. So I think in Caerdydd Penarth, it's looking like the leader of the Welsh Green Party, Anthony Slaughter, it's looking like he might get elected, but I think there's actually a chance that they might get a second seat there as well. So how will that influence how Plaid go about things? Because of course both parties quite similar, they do have their differences.
Yeah.
But yeah, how will they go about that battle in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also really interesting to examine because I think there's actually a lot of potential for cooperation between Plaid and the Greens. You know, the Greens are kind of quite well known for being quite fond of cooperation, and Plaid certainly aren't opposed to it historically either. And I think that it will be very, very interesting to see after this election, and even during it, kind of how the dynamic kind of plays out between Plaid and the Greens, because they're not exactly natural enemies.
No.
And I do wonder how kind of candidates and generally supporters of both parties are going to feel about them having to kind of go toe-to-toe with each other in a place that's kind of so generally progressive as somewhere like Caerdydd Penarth.
One thing I want to turn back to reform actually, because I want to point to some analysis by the Wales Governance Centre and Dr. Jack Larner, who is he's sort of like a John Curtis of like Welsh politics. He does all sorts of analysis. He's always on the TV and all that. But he's put on his Blue Sky some of his own analysis, and I think it's worth pointing to. So on reform, he's actually put together the aggregate polls and essentially put a trend line of where Reform's vote share is going. And it's actually showing that it's plateauing, which is interesting. I think it's too early at this point to necessarily say that Reform are finished. Of course, they're still polling really high. But it is worth comparing it to the UK polls, which are saying that Reform is also on the way down there as well. So where do you think that's coming from? Do you think Reform have a ceiling here that they're hitting, maybe?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a Reform ceiling, right? I think as well as that, there's definitely a sense in which perhaps some of the momentum is leaving Reform. You know, they've had a couple of slightly embarrassing electoral performances in by-elections, obviously, specifically in the Welsh context. Obviously, we had Caerphilly a few months ago. But also recently in Manchester as well with the Green MP victory.
Gorton and Denton, wasn't it? Yeah.
And I think with a party like Reform, you know, they rely a lot on the momentum, on the idea that something is happening, that something, you know, that you're part of something that's going to win. And just, I think, kind of unfortunately for Reform, they're not really doing a lot of winning at the moment.
They're not. It's quite interesting because there'll be the Senedd elections in May, there'll also be elections in Scotland, and there will be those local elections in England. So I think maybe those local elections in England especially could be a bit of good news for Reform in that sense. So it will be interesting to see what happens not only in Wales but across England and Scotland as well. We'll turn as well to sort of the trend lines for the other parties as well across the polls, because Reform's sort of plateauing, but by the graphics that I can see here, Plaid are on still an upward trajectory. Conservatives on the way down, Labour more steeply down. So kind of those traditional stalwart parties of Westminster and sort of politics for the last few decades, sort of both on the way down. Is there a way back for them, I guess, is the question here.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always a way back, isn't there? I think
there must be,
you know, it's very rare that you see a party just kind of completely fade into oblivion overnight. Obviously, it's happened. I mean, the Liberal Party a long time ago obviously kind of did precisely that and kind of found itself replaced by Labour. But I don't think that what's going on here is that, at least in the case of Labour. I think there's a case to be made that Reform are perhaps slowly kind of cannibalising the Conservatives. But I don't think that Plaid are on their way to kind of replace Labour forever. I think this is just kind of an instance of a sort of fairly natural, thing we see in most, democracies, where when one party becomes unpopular, it's replaced in government for a time by a different party. And I think that, for a country like Wales, where as we discussed, the voting kind of base is so left wing. I think that just because we're seeing one left wing party being kind of replaced here by another one, I don't think that means that one of them is kind of eating the other one alive. I think that this is just sort of a natural kind of shift in government that for some reason, well, not for some reason, obviously we know that Labour have been popular in Wales for a long time for good reason, but this is kind of, now it's finally happening in the way that it tends to happen in most other democracies, but rather than a left-wing party being replaced by a right-wing party, it's just two left-wing parties kind of switching places.
Yeah, well, to expand on that point as well, we saw with Keir Starmer, wasn't it, in the 2024 general election, everyone was saying, all the media were going, it's a Labour landslide, which it was, but then we've seen very quickly afterwards how support has diminished and how maybe that support wasn't support and it was simply just voting for the alternative option.
Yeah.
So I think that's worth thinking about as well for Plaid Cymru if they were to get in, or any party really, if Reform were to come into control as well. Can they sort of make that mandate into strong support that they can maintain? One more point to wrap up on this polling then, from this analysis by Jack Lana, is that different polls tend to sort of push different parties more up or more down. So I think this is worth looking at because say we look at YouGov, you can see that YouGov put Labour more down compared to other pollsters. The same sort of with the Conservatives, but they tend to put Plaid and the Greens more up. So while we're seeing results from these polls which may put Plaid very ahead, it might not necessarily be what we see on May the 8th when we do get those results in. So that is worth thinking about, isn't it? So any final thoughts on that?
I suppose the one main takeaway, I think, is that kind of no matter what, I think that the actual kind of governmental outcome of this seems to be fairly, at this point, almost, not necessarily set in stone, but, all of these polls, for all of their kind of differences, I think really what ends up being the kind of main question to take away from all of this is that after the Senedd election, it's going to be a question of how difficult is it for Plaid Cymru to govern.
It will be. Well, now we're going to turn to something that I'm calling the sixth seat dilemma. I'm going to sort of bring you up to speed a little bit then, well, you're up to speed, but bring our viewers up to speed a little bit with how the new voting system is working, and we will do a podcast on this a little bit more in the future. But essentially there's going to be 16 mega constituencies, right, and then 6 seats in each of those constituencies. So it means that regardless of what seat you're in, there will be 6 Senedd members who represent you.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, as it means that there's this sort of war that will be going on for the 6th seat in each of these constituencies. And some analysis by Grasshopper Communications has simulated how the 6th seat will actually work out in practice. And they've estimated that in at least 6 of those constituencies, the battle for the 6th seat will be Reform against the Greens, which creates an interesting dynamic because it means that if Reform win a lot of those 6 seats, then of course the Greens will have a lower turnout. But if the Greens have a better turnout, Reform will have a lower turnout. And that means that if it was a bit like that poll we were talking about, Plaid will have the opportunities that they will with the Greens. So do you think, how will this work? What is the sort of dynamic at play? And do the Greens hold the balance, do you think, in this election?
Yeah, I think it is really interesting actually because, if this is to happen with the Greens doing quite well in a lot of these seats, I think already it's quite a seismic shift to go from a Labour government to what looks at this point like almost certainly will be a Plaid government in some capacity. But I think what's even more kind of interesting is the possibility that it won't even just be that we're kind of moving from a Labour government to a Plaid government, but that Plaid might actually end up governing with the Greens or with a lot of support from the Greens. I mean, these are 2 parties that have never really had much control in the Senedd. Obviously, Plaid have worked with Labour in the past, but they've never been in government, and the Greens have never even had a single seat in the Senedd before. But I think, what's also very interesting about this is the fact that it's between Reform and the Greens.
Yeah.
We're talking about two completely different parties here, right?
Pretty much opposite ends of the spectrum at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it could be the thing that will sort of tell the story of that night, or no longer of the night, because of course they're not doing overnight counting, but it will tell the story, I think, of this election. So it will be interesting to see how it goes in that sense. But there's another point for this 6th seat which is quite important to the Conservatives and the Lib Dems. So under this poll, respectively, getting a whopping 1 seat between them, which is not great news, of course, for them. But how does this 6th seat dilemma affect them then? Because there'll be that battle between Reform and the Greens, but for the Lib Dems and for Conservatives, it's really a question of whether they're extinct in the Senedd, isn't it?
Yeah, I think ultimately, it's hard to imagine that they'll both go completely extinct. I know obviously the polling shows that the Lib Dems will not get any seats in the election, but I think that both of them should get at least 1 seat. But to be honest, I think, particularly obviously for the Tories, who are not used to having only 1 seat, to only get 1 seat in this election would be a complete disaster, I think, for them. Would make them completely irrelevant next to Reform. And for the Lib Dems, I know that obviously, whilst kind of relative to their position now, it's not terrible. I think for the number of seats obviously to go up in the Senedd, and for the Lib Dems to not see any increase off the back of that is a bit disappointing for them.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see how those small margins will really hold the balance for whether these parties do have any seats. Coming down to single-digit figures, isn't it? So it's around 12%, I think, for a party to be elected in a seat. So it will be really interesting, won't it? The day that this goes out will be the deadline for parties to put their candidates forward for the election in May, of course, which has made this week a very hectic one, as we've seen Reform putting out their list of candidates, of course, quite late. The Conservatives as well. So I think for some parties it's more a question of scrambling to find who they can put forward, right? Because it is a hard task having to find, vet and select 96 people to represent your party. And we've already seen a few controversial candidates in the media who have faced backlash. So there was a couple for Plaid, so there was one who used vulgar language that I definitely can't say on YouTube to describe children in a tweet back in 2021. He's since apologised for that unreservedly. And there was another one where he put on some song lyrics about drugs and all sorts of things, which we won't even get into. But it's not just a Plaid Cymru problem either. It is worth saying that this happens with all sorts of parties. So there was also a story this week that Nation did, Reform's top candidate for Penybont Bromorganog. So I guess there's a question about whether these things should be looked at as things that make a candidate step down. I believe Nigel Farage has actually stood with that candidate. But we're not going to get into the intricacies of each of these situations. We're going to talk about the wider question here, which is that are Senedd candidates up to the job? Is there sort of a decline in the quality of politicians because that has been sort of talked about a little bit? Or is it a wider question of the standards of politicians more generally, do you think?
Yeah, I do think it's actually a very interesting question, because I think it touches on one of those really interesting things about politics, I think, which is the degree to which politicians are, at the end of the day, they are people. And I think that, without defending these people, I think that, there's not really any person in the world that hasn't done or said something that, if leaked in this kind of manner, could possibly cause controversy. And I'm reminded of kind of instances of other politicians in other parts of the world. I remember a few years ago there was a big controversy about, I believe it was the Finnish Prime Minister, who was kind of caught at a party just kind of dancing.
I remember that.
And things like this, which again is something that isn't really, to my mind, the sort of thing that necessarily impacts on someone's quality as a legislator. It can be difficult because we want politicians to be people, but at the same time, there's this kind of a certain standard expected of them, kind of historically, and also while they are a politician. I think can make it a very, very fine line for people to walk where, you know, they're kind of on guard constantly for how things are going to appear, whilst also trying to be personable.
I guess it's kind of a case of the generation now that's getting into politics is sort of the first generation that grew up with social media.
Yeah.
So in some of the cases I mentioned there, a lot of what we're seeing is tweets and posts from years ago during their teen years being brought up to sort of go, this candidate isn't suited for the job. And I do agree with you that I think it's a really hard thing, because you can forgive for some things. It's really subjective, isn't it? But I think it is making things really hard for these politicians or prospective candidates. I think personally, if it was me though, I wanted to be a prospective candidate, I'd just get rid of all my social media, I'd just purge it all.
Yeah, I do wonder actually if that's kind of what we might see in future, whether or not, obviously parties have their own internal vetting process. I do wonder if we might see that eventually part of this simply becomes that you have to scrub all of your previous kind of social media. Although again, I do wonder how some of these things can slip through the cracks, because I you know, generally parties will look through someone's social media. So I think possibly what that even speaks to is the fact that a lot of the time it can be quite hard to tell which things are going to become controversies. You know? I think everyone's probably got some sort of skeleton somewhere, and it can often probably feel for parties and candidates like, to a certain extent, a bit of luck of the draw, whether or not the specific thing that someone has or hasn't done is going to be the thing that's picked up on by the media and becomes controversial. Yeah,
well, I think I've seen myself when I've been searching up some of the candidate names, especially the lesser known ones. I'll sort of go on their social media pages and they do sort of look weirdly empty, which makes me think, has the party maybe told them to get rid of like a lot of things they've had on their accounts? But that is an interesting thing to talk about. But when it comes to the standards of candidates, I think another question worth raising is how easy or hard is it for parties of all sizes to field 96 candidates? Because you've got to think, it used to be 60 seats in the Senedd, it's going to be 96 now. If you're a smaller party, and we'll use Plaid as an example, they're not a national party, are they? So they're going to have less resources in that sense, because other parties, if they wanted, they can sort of parachute people in, can't they? It's hard to find 96 people who are sort of squeaky clean to put forward and represent your party, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, for parties, I think it's really important to always remember that the people who are members of a party are often more, maybe radical isn't the correct word, but kind of more stringent supporters than those who simply vote for the party. And what that means is that you're probably more likely to have, in terms of people who are willing to, you know, put themselves forward as a candidate, the exact type of people who oftentimes might end up having said something a bit dodgy, you know, gone really far with a certain political opinion, or been very, very impassioned about certain political beliefs. And, you know, parties change over time, views on certain topics change over time, and that can become really problematic for people who are kind of consistently politically active throughout their entire lives, because they end up saying things, you know, however many years ago, that then become completely out of step with what the party thinks later. I mean, I struggle to think of an example for more on the left, but if you think about kind of right-wing parties, you know, in the early 2010s, you know, you had the Conservatives doing things like, you know, passing pro-gay marriage legislation. Generally, they were reasonably progressive, and obviously these days, with the kind of culture war and things like that, that kind of idea has completely disappeared from the right of British politics. I
think it's a balance here, isn't it, of being passionate as a politician or as a candidate, and being outspoken, but balancing that with ensuring that it doesn't impede on your chances when it comes to being a candidate. And I mean, it is a really interesting, I think it's going to make it a lot harder, isn't it, for candidates in the future if they want to sort of grow up in this age, and you might not be thinking much, isn't it, if you're a teenager, about what you're posting on social media, and then you want to have a future career in politics. Right, so it's time for us to pick our biggest winner and the loser of the week, as the election campaign is now well underway, so a lot of options for both of us. So who is your loser of the week, Adam?
So my loser of the week is Reform UK, kind of just generally. And the reason for that is that I think that as time goes on and as the polling kind of comes out, obviously we talked about it a little bit earlier, I think it's important to kind of really emphasise or really kind of think about the fact that it's becoming increasingly clear that not only are Reform almost certainly not going to be in government or kind of anywhere near legislation after this election, it's also starting to look more and more likely like they probably won't even be the large party. Obviously, it is this kind of two-horse race between Plaid and Reform, but it's starting to look a lot more like Reform are the underdog in that race. Obviously, it's too early to call it for certain, but I think it's starting to look a lot more like Reform are going to lose this two-horse race.
Yeah, well, it ties into those trajectories of all the polling that we're talking about. Plaid is
Precisely.
still on that positive trajectory, Reform starting to plateau, so something to keep an eye on. My loser of the week is also Reform-based. It's Nigel Farage, who, of course, UK leader of Reform. And I guess this goes a little bit more than a week back, but it's to do with the whole foreign speakers controversy, where he essentially, in a cameo, said something along the lines of, I don't want to talk to those foreign speakers. And he's talking about Welsh people, isn't he?
Yeah.
And I think for this, he is a loser, but only a slight loser, and that's because of the fact that, sure, it's not great to have the outtakes that were published of him doing his cameos and sort of messing up. Like, I think that's a loss for anyone. But I don't think it's really going to hurt politically any of his campaign.
No.
Like, let's be honest, Nigel Farage has just stood by a candidate who did a Nazi salute. I think he's got bigger fish to fry.
Definitely.
I think that it's not going to disrupt the flow of the campaign. I think he'll sort of keep going with the narratives that he's got to play.
Yeah, I agree.
So we'll turn to the winners of the week. Adam, who is your winner?
So my winner of the week is the Welsh Government in a somewhat limited capacity. Obviously, the Welsh Government has various difficulties as ever, but specifically in relation to the fact that a bill that is currently going through the Senedd to eventually ban greyhound racing in Wales was facing a legal challenge that has been kind of defeated or rejected by the courts. And I think this is kind of a real win for the Welsh Government on that, because I think it would have been really embarrassing if this proposed bill was kind of was declared to be illegal and couldn't go forward. So yeah, I think it's alongside some other bills that have obviously been kind of making their way through and finally getting passed, a bit like the lying bill and the glass deposit scheme. There are a lot of things that are kind of happening, and the Welsh Government isn't seeing a massive amount of disruption to its working at the moment. And I think just generally that's kind of a mild win for the Welsh Government there. My
winner of the week is, I've got a jokey one, which is the Labour ministers who are stepping down because they're free from the Senedd and don't have to sort of deal with politics ever again. But in all seriousness, it will be interesting because we're seeing, I think the Labour sort of cohort will change quite a lot. We're going to see a lot of familiar faces in the Senedd be going. But in all seriousness, my winner of the week is probably, I think it has to be the Greens, just because of the sense that they've had great polling coming out, which I think is truly incredible considering that Plaid are being perceived as the main left-wing option in this election. So to sort of coexist, I think, is quite a feat in itself. Especially to have such strong polling. I think it's definitely a win for that progressive bloc of voters, because if they do have the options like we were seeing in those coalition possibilities where we can have Plaid and the Greens working together to get things through, it's pretty much ideal, isn't it, for those voters? So I guess in that sense it can be perceived as a win for them. It could be perceived as a loss for the right-wing parties. But it will be interesting to see the Green performance, won't it? Yeah, I mean, I think actually it's really interesting when you think about the fact that only kind of a few months ago, really, it was kind of a question of whether or not the Greens would get any seats at all in the Senedd election, and if they would get kind of a few. And it seems that, they're kind of in their own, not quite as much as Reform a few, kind of a year or two ago, they've kind of had their own sort of meteoric rise in a way. Now we're talking about the Greens getting 10 seats or so. I mean, that's really quite the rise from possibly none. Yeah, it's sort of, I think a lot of it can be cited to the work by Zach Palensky, right? Because I think his leadership of the Greens has really propelled it very high up. Like we're seeing in the Westminster polling, is on a positive trajectory. And at the moment with Westminster polling, it's not easy to say that you're a party that is on the positive way up. I think most of the parties in recent polling actually went down. I think the Greens were one of the only parties to go up. So to see that being reflected in the Senedd as well, where I think like the Greens aren't really that established in Wales.
Definitely.
Like, because if you think about the profiles of Green politicians, we got the Wales Green Party leader, Anthony Slaughter. He doesn't have the greatest profile. I'll get the stats up on screen for how recognised he is, but he definitely is not very high up there. Zach Colensi, of course, being the Westminster leader, will be more sort of well known. But I do think it is quite a feat for them, and it'll be interesting to see where the Greens will end up. Well, that brings this episode to a close. Another busy week, and I'm sure it will only get busier. Plaid Cymru's campaign launch will be, well, today when this episode goes out. It's also the deadline for candidates, and the Green campaign launch will be tomorrow as well when this episode releases, so hopefully a lot more to talk about.
Yeah.
So we'll see you next week. Anything to promote? I keep telling you this.
You keep telling me it, and I keep saying that I don't.
One of these days. One of these days. Yeah. Well, you can find me on social media, of course. My handle is KDJ Bright. I'm a student journalist who's done a bit for Nation Cymru and the Will Hayward Newsletter. So keep an eye out, and hopefully you'll see some of my pieces in the media. Say a little bit about yourself. Go on.
I have so little to say.
Hey, what are you doing politically?
What am I doing politically? I am in a party. I am in
You
Plaid
are in a
Cymru.
party. You are indeed.
I suppose I can be found variously on social media that we can tag.
Just very healthily keeping away from it.
Very healthily keeping away from it for the most part. I write things that I don't publish, but perhaps one day they will be published.
Maybe one day. Gosh, I'm sure the viewers will be so happy to hear that.
So excited.
That one day they might have the chance to see something you've written.
To see something that I maybe wrote.
Right. Well, see you next week, Adam.
See you soon.